Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back in Singapore, and thank you all for coming here. It's been a very busy and hectic schedule. I was saying to somebody that I just saw a window today. I said to my wife, tomorrow morning we have a couple of hours free before I do anything, and now I have an 8 a.m. breakfast meeting. So, but in any case, I'm talking about an area where I'll begin just a little autobiographically so that you have a background because of the nature of what I'm going to be talking about. My first training was in Christian theology, and I was a young theologian back around the time of Vatican II. Prior to that, I had been in a monastery for 10 years and been married 54 years to that woman right there. And I was supposed to get a doctorate and continue to teach Catholic theology. And it was a time when we Catholics had theology, and like people of many faiths, we believed that our faith was the one true faith. It was truer than the rest. I went to grad school, and I went to a secular university, which is what I wanted because I'd always been in Catholic schools. And the first year you had to take a course in world religions. Well, I never took a course in Catholic studies for the entire degree. That didn't matter because one of the stars in that area insisted I'm one of his students on the internet all the time. When I do anything, my student John Esposito did this, and I always want to say, Len, I never took a course with you. But I got interested instead in Hinduism and Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and was going to do a dissertation in Hinduism when the chair said, you really should do something with Islam. We're hiring Muslim scholars, and I was very reluctant to do it. And in fact, really wouldn't have done it except for the fact that I was married and wanted to finish my degree. So I agreed to do one course, and I won't go into the whole story, but at the end of the day, I wound up doing a degree in an area in which there were no jobs. Okay, so that's the important thing. And I'm seen by many people as, you can tell from the way I talk, I come from New York, I'm seen as street smart. Okay? But for some reason, I can't explain why, I just became fascinated when I discovered that there was religion called Islam, and in fact, it wasn't over there intellectually with Hinduism and Buddhism, but was part of a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. We always talked about a Judeo-Christian, and then everything else was put on the other side. And then when I discovered the history of Islam and the period of history in which when the West was in its dark ages, Islamic civilization had grown in terms of science, etc. This is all stuff that I kept saying to myself, why didn't I learn this in school? So anyway, I became fascinated with it, and then things just fell into a place, and I finished my degree. And as could be predicted, there were no jobs in Islam. But because I had studied now 4 religions, I could be hired to teach world religions. Okay? So I get hired to teach, and in 1972, from 72 to 79, I teach, but I don't teach one course in Islam. Why? Because there was no interest in Islam. I taught world religion courses on Hinduism and Buddhism, and then 1979 came. I owe my career and my first Lexus to Ayatollah Khomeini, quite literally. Everything went through the roof. In the first 5 weeks, I had 3 book contracts. Before that, people would just say, wouldn't answer you at all, publishers, or they'd say, great idea, no market. In other words, nobody's interested in this. And so that's how I got into the field. All right, so today I'm going to be therefore looking at the role and future of religion in global politics, and I'll be referring to a number of religions, but I will be looking at times a little bit more at the Islamic side of things because I need to focus more, and I'm in an area where focusing on that Muslim aspect is important, especially if we're talking about international relations. Yes, Myanmar, some of the Myanmar Buddhists are doing terrible things, but that's in one place. And it's not going to be holding the attention of people as much as in the last few decades, people have been concerned about Islam itself, not just Muslim extremists, but Islam itself, okay? As a physician trained at Georgetown, both graduate and of the medical school, said to me, really bright guy, and at one point said, yeah, I'm really interested in religion. He said, because when you really look at it, all the religions preach peace, and then Muslims believe you should kill people. But he did it in this very nonchalant way. So we exchanged books after that. So let me make some observations on and how we got here and the way we even analyze because for the longest time, the study of the Middle East, the Muslim world, and training experts had nothing to do with Islam. The fact is, in the late 20th century, and it has stayed on a certain kind of mentality, the belief was that modernization depended on westernization and secularization. Okay, the only way to be modern, because modernization was, quote, developed in the West, and it had the modern institutions, whether it's education, whether it's the parliamentary system of government, etc. International relations followed that approach. And so a prominent scholar, writing on the passing of traditional society, okay, so you can see the judgment he's already making, said Saudi Arabia has two choices, Mecca or Meccanization. Okay, and one would say that, therefore, for the rest of the Muslim world by extension. What did that mean? The Middle East Studies Association had virtually no panels that dealt with Islam, nor on democracy, which also says what was taken for granted. The American Academy of Religion, the Academy of Religions, okay, had no coverage of Islam. It took several of us, I was a junior person at the time, with one of my professors, to prove over a 3 or 4 year period that there was even a market for this area. And I can tell you, it was a very nervous time. I would go to the American Academy of Religion as a junior professor, and I'd pray that there'd be somebody in a room that would even come to listen. And you might have 6 people come in, and after a while, 2 or 3 of them would leave. And all I could think of was, if any of my colleagues see this and it gets back to the university, it'll be, what's this like? That whole situation has changed, of course, completely after the Iranian Revolution. Our training of diplomats, no touch with religion and culture. Major schools of international affairs, Georgetown sees itself as the oldest school of international affairs. When I went there, they said that I should take another title in addition to the ones that I had. So I said, well, I'd like to take Professor of Religion and International Affairs, but I presume you have that since you're a school of international affairs, and this is a Jesuit university. And they said, no, we don't. Even in the curriculum, politics and culture didn't exist. When it was suggested, it's out. Now, politics and culture is like the area for people to study. MESA and the AAR had no coverage, and that meant that for many of us that were in the field, we were marginal members. After it began to shift, I became the first president of MESA who did a specialty in Islam. And in the American Academy of Religions, I became the second person who did Islam, who got in there. Before that, it would have been inconceivable that with that kind of background. I now led a center in which almost all of us had been presidents of MESA, again, which would have been seen, and I want to emphasize that because it means that we don't understand the religion, then where do we go with it? And part of what we didn't understand is that even when religion was studied, it was studied by a school of thought called Orientalism, which meant that it was text that you look at, not context. So you study the scriptures, the history books, but you don't necessarily do the context. A very prominent scholar of Sufism, Islamic mysticism, okay, developed his career sitting in the UK at a major university like Oxford and never felt the need to go to any Muslim country. Or if he had, he might go to a collection of texts. The idea that the contexts are important, okay, and critical. And we still make that mistake at times. When we want to judge Islam or we want to talk about violence, we'll look for texts. So people will always say to me something like, well, Ibn Taymiyyah in the 12th century said X. And it's sort of like, okay, so Ibn Taymiyyah said that. Does that naturally mean that then everything, follows? What else did he say? Or the Quran says Y. Well, what about the rest of the Quran? So, for example, when people talk about violence, let's say in Islam, in fact, if you look at the Quran, much of the passages talk for a more pluralistic approach. God says, I could have created you as one community, instead I created you as many to compete with each other. Where you do have warfare, it's when you're under attack, you have a right to fight and to fight strongly, but when the enemy desists, you have an obligation to desist. And yet none of those passages get taken, seriously. I've debated in Europe, in America, and there's always somebody in the audience that gets up and says, what about the sword verses? And they don't look, and there'll be Christians, etc. And if I say, what about the Bible? which has all kinds of violence in the Old Testament, let alone a passage where God basically calls for the destruction of everything, men, women, children, animals. Okay? Do we take that out of context? Does that represent what most Christians and Jews believe or their interpretation? All right. So all of this moves along, and then suddenly we come up with the resurgence of Islam. But we also see at the same time a resurgence of religion. And this would have been in the, let's say roughly from about 1960, 70 on, slowly we begin to see a resurgence in all the religions. Now, it didn't mean that religion wasn't there, but it means that you now had more people either in their personal life becoming religious and therefore, going to, to mosque, to church or whatever more often, but also for many others, not only personal life, but public life, okay? So some, it was simply personal life, becoming a better Muslim. For others, it meant becoming a better Muslim means that I also want to live in a Muslim society, or in a society that at least does not have laws that somehow go against Islam. And then we begin to see the emergence of religion both in politics and society. And we see it in two ways, mainstream and extremist. And that's what's important. And I'll get into that in a bit more detail. But if we begin with looking at Iran's revolution, 1978-79, you have the Iranian Revolution, you have the inconceivable happening. I have to ask my wife, would you signal me at some point when you think that I should stop? Then I know I'll go for another half hour, but that's okay. But I'm just conscious, I've got a lot of stuff to cover here. Okay, so with the Iranian Revolution, the idea that a mighty Shah, who had the second best military in the Middle East, Israel had the first, who had oil wealth, who had promised that by the next century he would have modernized his whole country, who was well educated, and who could appear on American TV with his wife, dressed in a Western fashion and speak English, and was seen therefore as the most modern of moderns. Just before Iran fell, he was in Washington with his wife, and Jimmy Carter praised Iran as that island of stability. Okay. And who was he overthrown by? A group led by an old man, Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been out of Iran for more than 20 years, first in exile in Iraq, and then for years in a town in France. You want to think about the significance of this. In the States, I will say to people, it's like you come from a town, somebody's a religious leader in a town in Virginia, and somehow is going to emerge as the icon for this movement. And a movement in which the only firepower that was expended was by the government, not by those who were in opposition. Okay? And what made it more of a threat was that he called for a resurgence in the region and also more globally. He's calling for, if you will, radical change. Okay. In light of that, Muslim countries that had already, some of them, appealed to religion, began to appeal to it even more. So part of Saudi Arabia's identity and its stability and its legitimacy is that what in fact is a family-owned country winds up basically, and tribal, basically legitimating their authority in the name of Islam. That the leader of the country is the custodian of the holy places. That Saudi Arabia is the home of Islam. It's where the revelation occurred. It's where the Hajj appears. So these governments use that religion to legitimate themselves. What gets missed in those days is the nature of many of those governments, and many of those governments were allies of Western countries, and that is that most of them are monarchies, most of them are authoritarian monarchies, and as a result are countries which both people blossom in, but also where there's a fair amount of repression if you disagree. But the realities are that the international relations, and even among academics who did research, was to basically focus on, if you will, the given, and not think about what could be behind all of that. And the given, was the oil wealth, the power of the family, the impressiveness of it, and the idea that how could you have an overthrow, given how securitized Saudi Arabia was, or how securitized Tunisia was, or how securitized Egypt was. I remember a woman very well educated in the UAE, and a bit of a friend, who said to me at one point when there were some troubles in Egypt, but Mr. Mubarak is the leader. Do the Egyptians have anybody who could run their country? Anybody else who could be in a parliament? And I said, you have all kinds of educated Egyptians, who are there and could be playing all of these roles. It was almost as if this is the only way. It became, all of these monarchies were seen as if the world is always going to be, not just that this is always going to be a monarchy, but it's going to be a monarchy like this, rather than, let's say, a constitutional monarchy, etc. So Muslim rulers, as well as mainstream opposition leaders that were emerging, mainstream opposition people that were calling for less repression, less authoritarianism, better educational systems, social services, okay? But also extremist groups emerging. So you had authoritarian regimes appealing to Islam. You had mainstream groups that wanted to see real reforms in the government appealing to Islam, and some of them became political parties where you could have a political party. Others had to operate in other ways. And you also then had the emergence of extremist groups. And it's really seeing the differences that's important. Because if you don't see the differences, one of the fallacies has been that any opposition, and any opposition in the name of Islam, even if it's an elected political party, is somehow a problem. And so there are those who distinguish between mainstream Islam and Islamic movements and extremist. And there are those who say, no, there's only one kind and it's dangerous. You've got extremists who are violent and mainstream who are wolves in sheep's clothing. Wolves in sheep's clothing. It took me about a year to get that down. I'd always say it's just the opposite. And Jean would also, her eyes would go like this, and I'd go, what's the problem? Sheep and wolves, okay. All right. So these Islamic organizations, though, began to really emerge to the point where in many countries you suddenly saw, across the Muslim world, Islamic parties, when elections were allowed, emerging and people being elected to parliament. Some of them even making it into cabinet positions, okay? But still, the political system was always controlled. So even in Egypt, when the Muslim Brotherhood could run, the system was controlled by the government. As to whether or not they could run, they were never allowed to be officially a political party. And it was also a kind of given that would be made known every time the elections. You can run, but you can't win too many seats, okay? It was that kind of restriction. Now, if we look back at the time of the emergence of religion in Israel, and I'll be briefly here, you have the emergence of what some would call Jewish fundamentalism, and of groups like the Gush Emanim. And these are groups that believe that not that we have an Israel or a state of Israel that in fact is open to a two-state solution, and that Arabs and Palestinians belong there and have been there, but rather, ultimately, these basically have been Jewish zealots like the Gush, and more recently there are other groups, now that have emerged, and you see it at election time, that basically what it is that they believe that Israel is a Jewish Zionist state. It's not really a democracy or a secular democracy where Judaism plays an important role, but rather it is a Jewish Zionist state, and that means that all of that territory, which includes the areas that we now find Arabs and Palestinians in, that's also part of greater Israel, greater biblical Israel. Okay. As I announce at all my talks, I'll look a little flustered because I'm not used to reading on both sides of a page. So often I have to look twice to make sure that I'm on the right page. All right. So therefore, Israel is not seen as an ordinary nation state, but a divinely mandated state, okay, a chosen people. And it is to be a Jewish state. And that has been realized when? Recently with Netanyahu, in which Israel has been declared formally as a Jewish state. And when it comes to citizenship, therefore, the fullness of citizenship is for Jews. For non-Jews, it's the equivalent of a secondary citizenship, okay? Because you lack one of the key things in terms of being a citizen, which is Jewishness or Jewish identity, okay? And therefore, that's one area. Now, at the same time, one can see in the last few decades the emergence of liberation theology in Central America, Latin America, and I just want to talk briefly about it because here you had, again, movements developing against governments that were very much authoritarian, and in fact, the rule stayed within the family. But not only that, but you actually had one country where the leading cardinal was also a member of the family, so there was a definite union of church and state. And instead you had Catholic theologians there, many of them, arguing for a preferential option for the poor. That in fact, these states in which had massive problems of poverty, of social dislocation, of social injustice, that in fact, if you really read the Gospels, if you were guided by the Gospels and the Jesus of the Gospels, that in fact what you saw in Jesus' message was a preferential option for the poor. In other words, who did Jesus really deal with? The poor and sinners were the primary audience that he dealt with, and whose lives he wanted to see improved, rather than dealing with a kind of hierarchical church, which is both political and religious, functioning within these countries. In South and Southeast Asia, the challenge of religious and ethnic nationalisms, as well as militant extremism, has been evident in countries like Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and I'll be coming back to that in a while. More recently, in the last couple of decades, you saw in Sri Lanka the struggle between Buddhist Sinhalese and the Hindu Tamils. Now, the Hindu Tamils are interesting here in terms of the force of religion. Tamils were not religious Hindus. In fact, they were Marxists. Some would say they were Trotskyites. But they realized if you want to mobilize the masses in terms of the identity that you established for your ethnic identity, that religion was such a powerful force that therefore the idea was that you had this, Sri Lanka with the Buddhist power, and then the idea of that northern Sri Lanka should be an independent state, and with a sense of Hindu nationalism. India, an ostensibly secular nation state, one is told that all the time, that it is a secular nation state, excuse me, has experienced multiple communal conflicts, not only in the past, but more recently in recent years, motivated by the challenge of religious nationalism from the Sikhs, demanding the independence in the Punjab, to the rise of the BJP, and a BJP that is now in power with Mr. Modi. And the BJP and Mr. Modi are very close to the RSIS, which in fact is a Hindu nationalist paramilitary organization, which has been behind attacks against Christian churches as well as Muslim mosques. And in fact, seizing some areas and saying basically that this is sacred Hindu ground where a Hindu temple once was, and there's a mosque here, and the mosque should be taken out, and this should be taking back this territory. While Mr. Modi presents himself, and in some aspects is a president of all India, when you really look at the attitude and the approach that exists there, it is very much an issue of seeing that the primary nationalism is a overwhelming Hindu nationalism, and that should be expressed obviously in the voting, but it also has been expressed in recent years with attacks against both Christians and Muslims. Yeah, there we go. I was just getting rid of the back of that page. All right. Now what I want to move to is the continued relevance of religion today. To tease that out even more, here looking at the Western context, and particularly America. America believes in separation of church and state, but we don't believe in a separation of religion and politics. But we believe in separation of church and state. But for many of those who practice religion and politics, they don't believe in separation of church and state. And the classic example is the rise of the Christian right. The backbone of the Christian right has been primarily evangelical and Baptist, but not all evangelicals and not all Baptists, but the thrust of a majority, okay? Evangelicals and Baptists basically are fundamentalist religions. That is, they believe in the literalness of God's word. and that there's an absolute obligation to follow that. In a book that Dalia Mugahid of Gallup and I did, and I used to be associated with Gallup, I'm not now, and it was called Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. It's a book that looked at 35 or 40 countries and interviewed people throughout these Muslim countries and looked at what do they really believe about everything, women, violence, the West, etc. But we also note that even in America, you can have at times as high as 40 to 44% of the American population that believe that we are a Christian nation and that in fact the Bible should be influencing our laws. And you see this played out with the Christian right in a variety of ways. Prayer in schools, religious objects, elections, the candidates that you back, so that you see that both with McCain when he ran in the past and also with Mr. Trump, there's a real turning to the evangelicals to get support for them. Many members of Congress are evangelical. Many members of Trump's administration are evangelical and or Baptist in background. The Secretary of State Pompeo and a host of others. Now, for them, for the evangelicals, they then became a real force during the Bush administration in elections. They were the swing. And every time Bush would run, his advisors would say to emphasize that swing, play that religious card. And it worked because you could develop a block of people who would vote and vote and would deliver in elections, both that is in terms of congressional elections, presidential elections, in terms of the selection of Supreme Court justices. I, as a, it's not that I'm hesitant in knowing who I am. I, as an Italian-American raised in New York, who's Roman Catholic, could never have believed when I was growing up that we'd have a Catholic on the Supreme Court. And when Mr. Scalia made it to Supreme Court, and he was a perfect gem because he went to the best schools. I think he did his undergrad at Georgetown and his PhD at the University of Chicago. As an Italian-American, I had to support him, although I didn't like his politics. I knew he was going to be very right-wing on the court. But in those days, who would have believed, because there was a real, it was Protestant-dominated, and Catholics and Jews were really not necessary or needed. You might get one. Who would believe that we now have the dominant number on the court are Catholics? Who would believe that Protestants, who in my time, as with Catholics, we'd be distanced from each other, as the other. And when it came to voting for the court, Protestants didn't want to see people, Catholics there. The Protestants would be nominating them, pushing it through Congress, doing backflips to get every time a court option opened to get a Catholic on it. We now have 5 Catholics on it. The head of the court, the last 2 that have been put on are Catholic and 2 put on before that. That's an incredible dominance. And that comes from a desire to have them there. The Christian right wants them there on issues like birth control, abortion, LGBTQ rights, religion in the schools. I mean, that will be raised. It doesn't mean that all the justices will go along with that. And a strong component of this among evangelicals is a Christian Zionism. That in fact, evangelicals and Baptists, because they take the Bible literally, tend to then take the Bible literally and see, therefore, Israel as only for the Jews and believe, therefore, in a kind of Christian Zionism. It is a strong support. Okay? If you read my book, The Future of Islam, I get into some of these people. 2 very prominent ministers were part of John McCain's team. When McCain ran the first time, he wanted nothing to do with this Christian right. When he ran the second time, he went to Liberty College or University to speak, and he brought 2 ministers on, John Hagee and Rod Parsley, to be guiding him. And if you read their writings and see their sermons, they see Islam as Armageddon, as it were. I mean, they see nothing in Islam. They're super negative on Islam. And the only reason McCain backed away from Hagee was when somebody pointed out that Hagee had been anti-Catholic 10 years before. And it had referred to the Pope, I think, as the whore of Babylon. I love that phrase. You can imagine what that did for Catholics. And why were they concerned about the Catholics and the Catholic vote now? Because Catholics had moved up from being working class into being educated and in prominent positions. And so the idea was, and many of those Catholics did what many people do when they start to make money. They're Democrats before, and then they shift over and become Republican. I used to say that to a lot of my American Muslim friends. I'd say, right now you're Democrats, you're going to go Republican. So when Bush ran the first time, some of my closest friends all got behind Bush, and look what they got for it. In fact, one of them was put in prison because he was seen as a dangerous professor during the Bush years. But in any case, you had that Christian right that then realized that there was an emerging Republican sector also of Catholics. And so today, if you talk about the Christian right, Catholics are also part of the Christian right. Not all Catholic Republicans are part of the Christian right. But it's not like in the old days when the Christian right was simply Protestant. Now, a lot of Catholics are. And they share a lot in common. Very conservative theology, very much into education at home for children. A brother of mine has had his 5 kids have been home educated right through high school. And an attitude, therefore, towards society and the public schools, etc. Okay. What about today? Today, residents in many countries continue to live or be influenced by religiously informed cultures, okay? So we don't want to get away from that. Many cultures still operate that way. Now, you can say in Europe that many countries have gone secular. Yeah, but not really completely, because the far right, when it often talks about its history, talks about a white culture and Christian culture. Many of them will bring that in. They won't be talking about that they want to necessarily, open up more churches, etc., but it will be the idea that we are, vis-a-vis these Muslims and these Buddhists, etc., our history is as a Christian nation. Our whole history and our expansion and etc. It's very much there. But in many other countries in the world, you see a real presence and strength of religion. So in Myanmar, Buddhism is an overwhelming strength. Now, it doesn't mean that all the Buddhists have been behind what has been done to almost 1 million people, and what some call genocide. The UN has seen what's going on with the Rohingya as the worst situation in this age that's taking place. But it is being led by, if you will, a hardline Buddhist. And maybe if you were a Buddhist, you might say he's a renegade Buddhist in his interpretation. But it flies in the face of our feeling that Buddhism is just a religion of meditation. The same thing is true with Hinduism. Usually with Hinduism, people see it simply as you study it in school, and it's the Upanishads and the text and the Bhagavad Gita, and so people think that Hinduism is simply a peaceful, and it's Gandhi, etc. When in fact there's a whole history also of military. I mean, the very caste system that you have, the second highest caste are the warriors. Despite the optimism of prophets of secular nationalism and the prosperity of some, many people perceive and experience the wide-ranging failures of the modern state today, and that comes into play. They see modernization and urbanization have often resulted in overcrowded cities, social dislocation. They see the concentration of power and wealth has increased while the problems of poverty, population, density, illiteracy have not been significantly improved. Government corruption, high unemployment, housing shortages have become endemic in many countries. And many people see that in terms of the nature of their government, which isn't responsive enough, and in some cases, if it's an authoritarian government, it then becomes a critique of the authoritarian government. And in terms of issues of social justice, etc., for many, they would ground that claim in terms of their religion to strengthen it. So it's not just, well, we're secularists calling for social justice, but this is the heart of our belief. We have an obligation to do this. And therefore, when they go to mobilize, and this can be mainstream, not just extremists, but to mobilize and develop strong Christian communities that work together, as well as push for reform, it will be in the name of their church and the teachings of their church. All religions, I would now want to say, as I move into the last part of my presentation, so you can all think well of that, but you don't even know what page I'm on now. There's actually more pages than there are now, but I'll cut some of it out. I want to begin with this observation for the next part that I'm talking about. All religions have a transcendent but also a dark side. So lots of people and religious leaders will opt for the transcendent side and ignore the dark side, even when we educate our children. You know, in America, how many kids knew the Crusades? And how many kids knew who won and who lost? It all depended on, if you were Protestant, you thought the Protestants won. If you were Catholics, you thought the Catholics won. And both of them were wrong. Okay, so they all have a transcendent side, and that's good. They believe in a God or in an ultimate reality or experience, okay? And that the transcendent side also is that religion helps us to transcend our baser natures, to be good people, to be more moral, to be more ethical. It helps us to answer those questions: who am I? Why am I here? What should I be doing? And why does it matter? However, historically, religions have also been used both by governments and terrorists to wage warfare, suppress dissent, and commit acts of terrorism. And so if you read the Jesus of the Gospels, a great book to read is by Gary Wills called What Jesus Meant. So he just looks at Jesus' teaching in the Gospels as over and against what the church then became, okay? When you actually take a look, what you realize is that after 3 centuries of, in fact, Christianity being a religion of the poor, the oppressed, etc., when it became imperial Christianity under Constantine, then you begin to see Constantine doing what other great rulers have done. You know, developing an expansionist policy, not only in the name of his power, but in the name of spreading Christianity, or for others in the name of spreading Islam, and for others in the name of spreading X or Y. And that becomes the dark side. Modern forms of religious fundamentalism or of religion in politics have been both mainstream and extremist, nonviolent and violent. Got it? Nonviolent and violent. But here's a dirty little problem. If you say that, people can go along with that, many. And so the context will be, does this group engage in violence? If that were the criterion, where the hell would America be today? And many other countries. We engaged in violence in our Revolutionary War, in our Civil War. And states all believe that they have the right to engage in violence when you're defending the state, etc. So that kind of distinction of saying, okay, if there's going to be a good movement here, social movement, it has to be that they're not calling for reform and possibly in the face of state violence, responding. So, where does that then lead us? I sometimes like to distinguish between mainstream Christian right and Wahhabi Islam. Both the Christian right and Wahhabi Islam believe that their text is revealed and take it literally, okay? Not all Muslims take their text literally. They believe it's the word of God, but it doesn't mean that they interpret it in a very literal sense, okay? But okay? They also engage in an exclusivist theology. I'm right, and if I'm right, you're wrong. And if I'm right, and I'm going to heaven, you're not. You're a nice person, but. I remember having a young kid at another university ask me to go for lunch, and so we talked about religion, and then after, and he talked about how he had converted to this evangelical, and his parents weren't, and so that was a real problem in terms of being saved. And when I left, I said, gee, we had a great lunch. You want to have lunch again? And he said, yeah, he was really interested. I said, well, why would you have lunch again with me? So he looked at me. I said, you know that you think I'm going to hell, so why would you want to waste your time having lunch with me? And he was kind of surprised, but I wanted to say, you want to think this thing through, all right? In terms of where you're going and where I'm going. And so what you wind up then is this exclusivist theology, which means my theology is right and yours is wrong. Okay? And this goes across religions and within religions. Okay? So, I mean, for example, there are 330 or so forms of Christianity. And probably 329 of them think that they're better than the rest. I mean, so it's to keep that in mind, okay, that exclusivist mentality. Now, having an exclusivist theology is not dangerous. It is a problem in our world that is becoming more multi-religious and multi-ethnic. Because if everybody's exclusivist, then it tends to be something where they have a minimal notion of tolerance. Tolerance, meant I permit your existence. But it didn't mean that I'd want to have you as a friend, a neighbor, a co-worker, hire you, or whatever. Okay? And so that's important to keep. So the exclusivism can be a social, but it's not a problem. But it lends itself or can be hijacked by extremists. Why? What does the extremist say? Take the extremist Christian. The extremist Christian will say, Catholicism is the one true, or Protestantism, or Christianity is the one true, let's say, okay, religion. Therefore, the others are wrong. Now, what does that mean in terms of my community? My community, therefore, should be following very rigorously an exclusivist theology. Our theology is right. Okay, it's not going to be inclusive. Okay, and what does that then lead to? If you're an extremist, you say, now wait a second. So what you're really saying is God commands us to follow the 10 Commandments, but now as we seek reform, we'll do 1 through 5 now and 6 through 10 later, because we've been pretty permissive society. Look at the way young people are. In the West, they're living in co-ed dorms, and in other places, they're doing X and Y, so we can't immediately make that change. No. The hardline fundamentalists will say God's word needs to be implemented now. So if we're talking about sexual ethics, whatever, it should be implemented now. It's right or it's wrong. And the danger with that is that it then allows that extremist to be saying not only that other people are wrong, other faiths, but that within their own faith, anybody that doesn't take that position is really not a good Catholic or a good Lutheran or especially if you get into the is a good evangelical. And in fact, you can be pushed out, out of the movement. That worldview then gets appropriated by extremists that add another thing. And that is, if this is wrong, and if we live in a world in which we are often dominated by an expansionist Christian West, for example, okay, we need to fight back. Why? Because they're oppressing us. The best place to see this is to look at bin Laden's CNN interview. It's the first major interview that he gave. Depending on your politics, you can read the first few pages as really interesting, political. You can say not only do a lot of Arabs and Muslims think this, a lot of academic experts think that there are issues with regard to Palestine, issues with regard to colonialism, issues with regard to becoming dependent on Western states, issues on the fact that if you let the West come in with their arms, they don't leave. All of those arguments are there. But it's when he then makes that argument and critique that he then moves to, in a sense, say, I've just shown you how, okay, we are the oppressed. They are the oppressors. The oppressed have a right and an obligation to fight against oppression. Whether it's the state that's militarized and would seek to crush us, or whether it's Western powers that would seek to control us by invading our countries. So once you get to that point, this is where the situation really becomes difficult, because what they then are able to say is that God commands this. This needs to be implemented and implemented immediately, and anyone who refuses this, okay, is an enemy, and that means even people in our faith. They are a double enemy because they've been in the true faith and they're not living according to it. The vision here then becomes a cosmic war between good and evil, a cosmic war between good and evil, between the army of God and the forces of Satan. And once you have that, it then means that religiously motivated and legitimated violence and terror can be seen and reinforced by, if they're seen as religious and commanded by God, as at the ultimate authority, demanding a kind of moral life, and so you have a moral justification for what you're doing, and it motivates and enables you to recruit. What are government responses like? Government responses to religious movements have varied from co-option and control to condemnation, suppression, and repression. Many governments in the Muslim world, especially monarchies, have appealed to religion even more to enhance themselves. So the Saudis, at a certain point, took the phrase for the king, because some people were saying he's always, in Arabic referred to as a king, and there really shouldn't be any kings, that kind of thing, as the custodian of the two holy places, Mecca and Medina, okay? It gets really long when you're doing this in Arabic and trying to refer to him in conversations. We're now introducing you to the custodian of the two holy places, okay? But you see, the Saudis already had this kind of religious cachet with their closeness with the Wahhabi establishment. But now you have the king trying to make himself look even more religious. And other leaders often became closer to religion. Sadat, when he came out of power, began to be seen as the believer president. He had a pronounced mark on his forehead from praying all those years. He created more mosques in Cairo than you could imagine, because it was not only creating what we would see as formal mosques, but if you had an apartment complex and you had a room that was called a mosque in that apartment complex, you got special deals in terms of reductions in what you had to pay. And as a result, he did all of that. And he would begin all of his speeches with religious phrases, okay? At the same time, he could be authoritarian and very much the patriarch. He was doing it as a patriarch, okay? So we see that with a variety of governments. Although they can justify the suppression of violent revolutionary movements that pose a direct threat, though it's much harder to oppose movements that actually function within the system. And that's what makes these movements even more of a threat to an authoritarian government. If you see, an authoritarian government has an easier time with extremists in the sense of being able to crush them and feeling there's popular support. But what do you do when you're crushing a group like the Muslim Brotherhood that's running free education, free social clinics, free summer school for kids, etc., and that when there's a crisis, they get to the crisis if there's an earthquake before the government does? It got to a point where the government made it illegal for anybody to go there before it did. But it said it was because they wanted to make sure that, the roads weren't jammed, etc. But so mainstream outfits become even more of a threat, and especially if they run for office and they do well, because the line of most governments were, A, you don't give these mainstream people a vote, because even if they look like they're nonviolent, they're wolves in sheep's clothing, and also they would lose. And then when elections were held, in a number of instances, they found that they did quite well. Especially in elections where you were not allowed to be on TV, you were not allowed to gather in large groups, you were not allowed to do a whole variety of things, and yet people could actually do well. So governments became even more repressive there. Now the last part of it. Is religion the primary cause and catalyst for Muslim political violence and terrorism? And should that be the approach of combating violent extremism? CVE policy, combating violent extremism, which is what all nations are concerned with today. Okay. Major polls by Gallup and Pew, and you can look this up. This isn't just a great thing about the internet. You can look this up, okay? And then write to me and say, wisdom, let us attend. Okay, that's actually taken from an Greek Orthodox liturgy before the reading of the Gospels. But anyway, I always like that phrase, so I use it in secular fashion. If you look at major polls by Gallup, Pew, Zogby, they've consistently reported that Islam is a significant component in religious and cultural identity. That is, if you ask many Muslims, what makes them feel really, what's important to them, makes them feel really good, it's that sense that they have a faith. And it gives them a sense of meaning. It doesn't mean that they're all praying at the same time, etc., but it means that, they see that and they see it as important for themselves personally, but they want to see it in their society as well, okay? That is, that the society actually is not doing that which is incorrect or wrong, okay? So it becomes then an instrument, though, for violent folks to legitimate their recruitment, mobilization, and the actions that they commit. So that then what they can commit are actions that normally are forbidden by Islamic law. They can kill indiscriminately. But you see, the argument that's used is, hey, this is a cosmic war. They have overwhelming force that we're up against. We don't have all of those weapons. This is an asymmetric war. It's not army to army. Therefore, we have to do things like suicide bombings. Because the whole idea, suicide bombings are not meant to win the war numerically. They're meant to win the war strategically, i.e., if you do it enough to make things vulnerable enough that countries' rulers will feel pressure to back off. Okay. The Gallup World Poll of some 35 countries found that the most frequent response to what they admired about themselves was their attachment to spiritual and moral values. Majorities of Muslims report wanting democratization, freedom, and civil liberties, all of which they don't get. And before the Arab Spring, I can tell you, whether you're talking about Libya, Sudan, Egypt, I remember being in Egypt with a young man, and he said, people don't realize, he's like in his early 30s, he said, the only president we know is Mubarak. And the only world that we know is Mubarak, with all its limitations, which then tell us all the things that we're not going to be and can't do. And what he did was he had pictures of Mubarak and then all the American presidents that Mubarak had been, president. And you suddenly realize what it meant to say somebody's in there for 30 or 32 years. The same thing's true for Gaddafi. The same thing is true for, the way things were functioning in the Sudan, certainly in terms of Tunisia. You have a society and a cultural values that has become integrated. And this becomes a problem, and I don't have a chance to get into it, when in fact you start talking about reform. Because even the reformers have been raised in a culture of authoritarianism. And so the first thing you would do if you win a war is arrest the opposition. Classic example. After the fall of Egypt and Tunisia, I have to end this in 5 minutes. After the fall of Egypt and Tunisia, we held a conference in Istanbul, and we invited many of the players, the organizations, Ennahda, the Muslim Brotherhood, the young people, etc. However different they were, they all had two concerns. One was the deep state. In other words, are we really going to be able to pull this off? We may have knocked out the top guy, but all the people that were appointed, the chief attorney generals, the legal system, the military, the police, the security forces are still in place. And as one person said, he said, when you had the American Revolution, the winners win, the losers lose, or they're put in prison. When you had the French Revolution, you had. But in our case, we've got that deep state to deal with. And the second thing they were concerned about was, will the West, despite what it says, really believe in self-determination and democracy? I.e., can Western governments accept an election that has people that are critical of Western governments, that are independent, or won't they? And I would say on both counts, what you see in the response to the Arab Spring is the answer. And for that answer, you have to come to my lecture on Friday. Okay. I think it's on Friday, I forget. In any case, but what you really see is the deep state did stay. There never was a Morsi government. There was a Morsi presidency. You can't have a Morsi government when the president does not name and control, as it were, in appointments, the attorney general, the key security outfits, etc. You can't. And that's why, at a time when there was a run at the presidential palace, the police were invisible. A policeman came and did a closed session in Washington with government officials. And in it, he was asked what the policy was after the fall. And he said it was to hang back on anything. Don't go out into the streets. Let the chaos come, and then you blame the people that are in. Okay. So, how have majorities of Muslims, for example, viewed AQ and ISIS? A Zogby poll of 8 countries found that 3/4 of the people completely rejected ISIS and Al-Qaeda. A Pew report in 2015, and I'd say it's even stronger now, found overwhelmingly negative views of ISIS across Muslim-majority countries. Indonesia, Malaysia, you name it. I mean, and even when you look at the uprisings that occurred, the uprisings that occurred in Tunisia, etc., were not to support bin Laden or ISIS. They weren't even to support particular religious mainstream Muslim groups. It was a cross-section of society. Where do we go from here? It seems to me we have two things to worry about. A Freedom House study has showed that its 2018 study, 71 countries have suffered a net decline in political rights. Okay? This is in 2018. If you then look at 2006 to 2018, 113 countries have backed away from democracy. Before it was that there was more movement towards democracy and greater political rights. Understanding this becomes important. A study of religious conflict by Pew showed that 33% of 198 countries have significant religious problems. Significant religious problems. But it does say that it's not saying that religion is the primary cause. You know, religion is there, but they point that out. So in conclusion, you know, where do we go from there, and where do we need to move to? Now, of course, with these pages, this will just take me 1 second. All right. To make you feel good, that's all that's left. Now, how long it takes me to unpack, that's another question. All right. What we need is the most obvious thing. We need a robust pluralism, a robust political and religious pluralism, which we don't have in many countries. And what does that mean? I believe that pluralism is the challenge of the 21st century. Because put aside everything that I've just said, I mean, put it aside because I'm going to give you another example. Look at what's happening in Europe and America. We've got right-wing groups, white nationalists, white supremacists, okay, that believe in, ultimately, in exclusion. They're anti-immigrant, they're anti-Jew, they're anti-Muslim, they'd be anti-Sikh, etc. Since Trump has been elected, the Southern Poverty Law Center says the spike has been such that we have 1,028 hate groups. Triple the Islamophobia. And you are living right now in a country that for the last 2 days has broadcast a 1-hour program on a lot of this that is incredible, and I can't remember the name of it. But it's been shown 3 times in the last day and a half. And it goes across the world, and it really gives a good insight how this cuts across in many different ways. It's not only the religious right, it's the non-religious right, but like the religious right, can share things in common. But what we are seeing is in Europe, the second most important political parties are often the parties that are a problem. And the idea of saying, well, in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders' party was going to win, but now they lost. They didn't lose. They came in a strong second. If you're a strong second, you got to wait and see what happens the next time. In France, why is it that countries like Hungary and Poland that don't have significant Muslims are anti-Muslim, that don't have real immigrants are anti-immigrant in terms of the policy? So it's a robust pluralism. The U.S., Europe, and other secular or non-Muslim democracies need to work with Muslims and others to create a new inclusive narrative at home and abroad. People like Mustafa Sherish, for example, the former Grand Mufti of Bosnia, and others have been working to elaborate an inclusive, pluralist, interfaith, European sense, because Bosnian Muslims will say they're part of Europe, but also see it as something that they should be doing in tandem with the government. Not that the government should be using it and controlling it, the way in which the French sometimes want to do that. Well, we're going to define French Islam, and we're going to define who's going to be in the mosques. This is also going on, really going on in Austria and Vienna right now. Okay, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a real coming together in a partnership. And it has to be a robust political and religious pluralism. Because if you look at the politics in many countries, even among political parties, it gets so nasty and so deviant and devious that even people with integrity get to a point where, oh my God, I'm a conservative Republican or a mainstream Republican, but my people, the polls show, will go with Trump and the Tea Party. If I want to get elected, I've got to change what I'm doing. It's that kind of a position we have to move to. As we see the world that we live in, only we can change it. The great thing about what I do is when I first got into it, nobody was interested in it, okay? So nobody would show up. The great thing about what I do now is that not only do I wind up with good audiences, but I can actually say to an audience, if things get really screwed up, if this were Brooklyn, I'd use a different phrase, much stronger, and my wife's here, so I won't use it. But if things get really screwed up, you're screwing yourself if you don't get involved. Because most people, when I grew up in my dad's population, you left it to other people. At minimally, you went to vote, but the idea was you vote for your congresspeople, etc. And, you know, what could possibly completely go wrong? Today, we all have a vested interest in it. You know, the wrong governments and that lead to a widening gap between rich and poor are a real threat to our society. And while many people may hate that and not go to violence, they may vote for real right-wing bigots, okay? On the other hand, a small group will become radicalized. And that's the issue. There's a real fear among some in the United States when Trump ran against Hillary Clinton, that if Hillary Clinton won, some of these real right-wing militias would go to violence. And there's even more of a fear that if Trump loses a second time, that it'll occur. Trump's already announced that if he loses, it's going to be because of fake news and manipulation. And there'll be a sense of wanting to see his supporters in the streets. So we have that ability. And you're in a region where there are lots of issues that occur and where relationships between countries and also communities are important. You have a jump on being multi-ethnic and multi-religious. Having had that jump doesn't mean that it always was handled as well as it could be. But you certainly have been moving in a right direction in many ways. I see government involved in a concern about interfaith relations in terms of the pluralism in society. Okay? Now, clearly, government's doing it for government reasons, but that's good. It gets it out on the table, and it allows for conversations in which the government not only can but should turn to others, you know, to provide perspectives, and the others in society that are parts of NGOs or just individuals or experts can expect that government will provide them with an opportunity to talk about this, so that we move to either getting rid of the word tolerance or that we use tolerance and say, no, a new tolerance means that we have pluralism and that we tolerate others based on mutual understanding and respect. Understanding doesn't mean I agree with everything that you believe in, but that I take the time to understand you and I respect that you have a right to think differently, etc., as long as, you know, you're not a violent group that's going to do something to me. Thank you.